Welcome to Deloitte's Debrief Tax webcast series in Asia Pacific. Our webcast today is from our Indirect Tax series and is on the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, or the RCEP in short, and its impact to global trade. My name is Meng Yu Wong, and I am a tax and legal partner based in our Deloitte Singapore office. I have the pleasure of hosting today's webcast. I'm pleased to introduce our speakers today, where we are joined by David Ware, a partner with our Australia office. David is based in Melbourne, and he leads the customs and trade practice in Australia. David focuses on bringing innovative customs solutions in the market and is currently the global project lead for Deloitte's customs data analytics tool, the Global Trade Radar. Next, we have Dolly Cheng, a partner in our Deloitte China office. Dolly leads the customs and trade practice for Eastern China and is based out of Shanghai. She has close to 20 years of experience practicing in the area of customs and trade, having assisted many multinationals who have entered China over the years that it has become part of the WTO. And finally, we have Mitsuko Fukunaga, a partner in our global trade advisory practice based in Tokyo. Prior to joining Deloitte, Mitsuko worked for a leading Japanese manufacturing company, where she brings in-depth industry experience dealing with various customs and trade matters and optimize the supply chain. You may access the bios of our speakers at the top left-hand corner of the screen. Before I introduce the agenda for today's webcast, I'd like to take a moment to highlight some of the features of our new webcast console. Firstly, all the users are on listen-only mode, and if you have any content-related questions, you can submit it at any time in the Q&A box, and we will do our best to respond to the questions at the end of the presentation. Secondly, all PC users can maximize or minimize each of the boxes at your convenience, and you can download today's slides by going to the Downloads and Links box. And lastly, if you require an attendance record, you can download the CPE certificate at the end of the webcast by clicking on the Request CPE icon. And for more information, you can visit our AP Debrief website. So for our session today, we will start off with an overview of RCEP and what it covers. Then we will go into more specific chapters around trade in goods and what the opportunities are around supply chain planning. And with any duty scheme savings, origin verification is important. So we will cover some of the key areas to watch out for when doing origin verification audits, especially in the context of RCEP. And next, with the rise of e-commerce and the myriad of opportunities that it brings to companies seeking to expand overseas, we will also cover some of the commitments under RCEP with a key focus on China as one of the stronger proponents of e-commerce trade in the region. And as with any FTAs, in addition to the traditional chapters for goods, we will also cover the trade and services and investment chapters. So we'll cover these briefly and provide you with the key highlights before ending off with a summary of the key takeaways and a short Q&A at the end. Next slide, please. So what is RCEP? It is known by many names, either as a multilateral free trade agreement or a mega regional free trade agreement that was signed on the 15th of November last year between 15 member countries comprising the 10 ASEAN member states and also 5 of the larger economies in the APEC region, comprising China, Japan, Australia, Korea, and New Zealand. The RCEP was designed to integrate and update all of the existing FTAs signed between these 15 countries and combine them into a single multilateral pact within the APEC region. It is also the first FTA to connect 3 of the largest Asian economies, namely China and Japan, and between Japan and South Korea. The agreement will take effect at least after 6 of the ASEAN countries, and 3 of the non-ASEAN countries ratify the agreement, and that is expected to be at the end of 2021 or even going beyond into 2022. Next slide, please. So what does the RCEP cover? Essentially, the agreement consists of 20 chapters, 17 annexes, and 54 market access schedules. The chapters can largely be divided into 5 broad categories, the trade in goods chapters, the trade in services chapters, the business environment chapters, the developmental chapters, and finally the transparency chapters. On the next slide, in terms of the opportunities available, without going too much into detail, as we will be covering the contents throughout the presentation, this slide shows you the overview of the opportunities under each of the respective chapters, ranging from duty reduction opportunities over a 20-year period under the trade in goods chapter, opening up of services markets and the ability to move people and business travelers into the different 15 countries, the protection of investments, transparency with regards to access to government procurement tenders for both goods and services, and finally the avenue available to companies and member states when FTA benefits cannot be obtained due to frustration brought about by member state action. So with that, I would now like to turn to David to take us through the trade in goods chapter in more detail and to highlight the opportunities that RCEP brings for supply chain planning. David, over to you, please.
Thanks, Meng Yu. As mentioned today, I'll be covering RCEP and the trade in goods, highlighting opportunities for supply chains. I'd like to first start off with a polling question, which hopefully everyone can see on their screen at the moment. The question is your business actively investigating RCEP customs duty savings opportunities? There are 5 options. Yes, we are actively reviewing the tariff schedules and our supply chain to identify customs duty savings opportunities. Not yet. We are planning to investigate in the next 6 months. No, we have not taken any steps to date, but plan to. And no, based on previous experience, we'll only actively pursue opportunities when RCEP enters into force or don't know, not applicable. So if everyone's able to lock in an answer there, that would be fantastic.
And David, based on what you've seen with other new free trade agreements, do companies tend to actively investigate opportunities upfront before the agreements actually enter into force?
Some do, but in my experience, most are more reactionary and tend to react after agreements enter into force. And this delay often leads to missed opportunities to save customs duty through structuring supply chains to take advantage of the savings that are available. So let's see the answers from the audience. So most, in terms of the top 5 there, most are saying that they're actively reviewing the tariff schedules. In fact, it's a fairly even split, but that's really good to see that most are either actively reviewing or they're planning to investigate in the next 6 months. So that's great that the companies are looking to take steps to implement RCEP and take advantage of what it offers. So next slide, please. So RCEP is great news for trade in this region, and as mentioned, it provides the first free trade agreement for some significant global trade lanes, namely China-Japan and Korea-Japan. Under RCEP, more than 90% of the tariff lines will eventually reduce to duty-free. And note that these reductions do differ by country. There are also some bilateral commitments, such that the rates can differ between countries. So it is important to be across the detail in that respect. Next slide, please. So at present, Asia-Pacific has many free trade agreements. Some are multilateral and some are bilateral, but no Asia-Pacific FTA is of the scale of RCEP. The current situation means that there is a need for suppliers and manufacturers to assess eligibility of the same goods under multiple free trade agreements, depending on the destination country. This means there are different rules of origin to consider, different cumulation rules, different certificate of origin requirements, and different consignment rules. This makes compliance and utilising the various free trade agreements time-consuming and burdensome. RCEP does provide the opportunity to remove this complexity by having one consistent approach across 15 countries. Next slide, please. So in relation to the rules of origin, RCEP brings one set of unified rules of origin and removes the need to consult with multiple sets of rules. RCEP, in most part, does have friendly rules of origin, or in other words, somewhat low thresholds when goods are imported from non-RCEP countries and then further manufactured in an RCEP country. One issue to consider, and this applies to all free trade agreements, when doing a regional value content calculation, is the issues that retrospective transfer pricing adjustments can cause. For example, if raw materials are imported at a transfer price between related parties, and this price is used as part of the regional value content calculation, and the qualification or non-qualification is close to the required percentage, a post-importation adjustment to value may actually change whether particular goods meet the rule of origin or not, which can impact the eligibility to use a free trade agreement, or can impact eligibility to use a free trade agreement that's already been used, for example. So this is something to consider, and something that is relevant, particularly as we see most multinationals undertaking year-end transfer pricing adjustments. Accumulation. So this is a significant advantage of RCEP, as content and materials from any of the 15 countries is considered originating content. This provides manufacturers with choice in terms of sourcing inputs, as no matter which of the 15 countries the inputs are from, they are considered as originating content for rule of origin determinations. Next slide, please. On certification of origin. So at present, some free trade agreements require certificates of origin to be issued by an authorised authority, issuing authority, and this is the only option. While that still exists under RCEP, there will be an option for exporters to register with the authorities in their country to become an approved exporter. The processes to do this will differ by country, but at a high level, the exporter will need to have a good compliance record, demonstrate knowledge of how rules of origin work, and maintain an adequate record-keeping system, among other requirements. So if you are an exporter, you should monitor these requirements in the relevant countries, as being an approved exporter may give you a competitive advantage over your competition and may well even be a requirement from the purchaser. There is also provision in the agreement as well for any exporter to issue declarations of origin. However, countries have up to 20 years to implement such measures. Additionally, back-to-back certificates of origin are possible under RCEP. This is where goods are initially shipped from one RCEP country to another and then exported to a third RCEP country. It is possible for the intermediary country to issue a back-to-back certificate of origin based on the original certificate of origin and confirmation that the goods have not been transformed in any way in the intermediary country. Additionally, the issue of third-party invoicing is addressed in RCEP. The invoice does not need to be issued by the exporter or producer of the goods in order to be able to use RCEP. In relation to the consignment rules, under RCEP, there is no general right for goods to be shipped via any RCEP member in order to retain origin and be able to use RCEP. Goods that transship through any country, even an RCEP country, must remain under customs control and have no further processing. In circumstances where the goods enter the intermediary country, consideration should be given to the back-to-back certificate of origin option that I mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. I've included a practical example. In this case, goods are manufactured in Japan using inputs and materials sourced from Thailand, Malaysia, China, and Indonesia. The finished goods are then exported from Japan to China, Korea, Australia, and Indonesia. For the goods destined for China and Korea, RCEP is the only option, as there are no existing free trade agreements between Japan and China and Japan and Korea. For goods destined for Australia and Indonesia, the exporter has the option of utilising a number of existing free trade agreements or RCEP once it enters into force. There are two main advantages here from using RCEP. Namely, only one set of rules of origin need to be considered and validated across the shipments to the 4 countries. This removes duplication of effort in qualifying goods across multiple free trade agreements. Secondly, the accumulation benefit. Given the inputs from the 4 countries listed, the best chance of qualifying the imports into Australia and Indonesia will be under RCEP. This is because the inputs from China, for example, will be considered non-originating materials if you are trying to qualify the goods under the existing free trade agreements listed on the slide. Whereas under RCEP, all of the parts and materials will be considered to be originating. With that, I'll now hand over to Mitsuko to cover the verification requirements and its impact on business.
Thank you, David. And again, thank you everyone for joining this webcast. In this part, let me explain the verification under RCEP and how it impacts on your business. So first, please let me make a polling question. Has your company had a verification for existing FTAs or GSPs which your company utilizes? And your options are, yes, we have had a verification and could close without any problem. Yes, we have had a verification. We had some troubles with the authority. Not yet. We have not had a verification yet while we utilize FTAs. No, we do not utilize any FTAs.
Mitsuko, just one quick question from me. Do you have the impression that the inquiries on origin verifications have been increasing or will increase by foreign customs authorities on the either Japanese-based manufacturers or otherwise, based on your experience and observations?
Yes, we support various Japanese companies for the utilization of FTAs, and in recent years, the number of inquiries on verifications is increasing. In particular, after the effectuation of the Japan-EU EPA and the TPP. In addition to customs authorities of the EU member countries, verifications by Asian countries also seem to be increasing. So let's see the answer from the audience. So no seems the majority at this moment. However, I expect the number of verifications will increase following the effectuation of RCEP. Then, let's see what is verification and how the verification impacts on your business. Next slide, please. As you may know, verification is, so to speak, customs audit for FTA utilization conducted by the customs of importing country. Under RCEP, as well as other FTAs, the customs authority of the importing country can conduct a verification in order to determine whether the imported goods satisfy applied rules of origin and the RCEP and qualifies as an originating good. In the verification, various matters are checked by the authority, for instance, whether necessary evidences or on origin determination, as well as shipping documents are properly stored, whether the country of origin determined in accordance with the specified rules of origin, whether the applied HS codes of the imported goods and parts, materials were appropriately determined, whether the individual requirements for manufacturing procedures were appropriately satisfied. If your company is subject to verification, you need to answer to these inquiries and provide necessary evidences in a timely manner. Next slide, please. So there are 4 patterns of verification under RCEP. First, the customs authority of importing country make a written request for additional information from the importer. Second, the customs authority makes a written request for additional information from the exporter or the producer, manufacturer of the exporting country. Third, the customs authority makes a written request for additional information to the authority of the exporting country, which issued certificate of origin or other competent authority. And fourth, the customs authority makes a verification visit to the exporter or producer in the exporting country. Pattern 1, 2, or 3 are popular patents, but the user of RCEP can also receive a verification visit that is pattern 4. In this case, a large amount of manpower is required. Further, pattern 1 is a pattern in which importers are required to provide additional information. However, information on the country of origin is generally held by exporters or producers. So, it is very important that importers, exporters, and producers confirm how to respond and how to contact each other if they receive verification. Next slide, please. Then, let me make the third following question. Does your company have internal rules, guidelines, or operational flows for origin control to utilize FTA and FTA verification? And your options are, yes, we have both internal rules, guidelines for utilizing FTAs and operational flows for verification. Yes, we internal rules, guidelines for origin control to utilize FTAs, but do not have operation flows for verification. Yes, we have operation flows for verification, but do not have internal rules, guidelines for origin determination. And no, we do not have any internal rules, guidelines, flows concerning origin control and verification.
Mitsuko, I'm not sure whether it's only on my end that the slides seem to have stopped, and we haven't moved on to the polling question, but just in case it's only on my end, while the audience are going through the various options, can I just ask if you typically receive requests from Japanese or foreign multinational companies to assist with designing, such SOP or guidelines to deal with verification audits?
Yes, such requests seem increasing after the signature of our RCEP, especially by the Japanese companies. Together with the establishment of rules or guidelines, some companies are considering to utilize IT solutions for secure use of FTA. So then let's see the answers from the audience. Okay, so no seems major at this moment. However, as the number of verifications increase, the necessity to establish internal rules or guidelines are increasing. So next slide, please. If you receive verification, and in case the customs authority denies the originating status of the imported goods, the goods should not be subject to preferential tariff under RCEP. In such a case, verification may have significant impact on your business. Needless to say, there will be monetary impact. In addition, other impacts should be taken in consideration. For instance, a large amount of manpower is required in order to respond to additional requirements of customs authority. Impact on supply chains like suspension of customs clearance. Further, to fail in verification may cause reputation risk. Next slide, please. As I said, recently, the number of verifications is increasing. There are some reasons, for instance, decrease in tariff revenue due to increasing the number of FTAs. origin determination is more and more complex and difficult as there increase various types of FTAs having various patterns of origin rules. Further, introduction of self-certification scheme may cause the increase of verifications. I suppose the number of verifications will further increase once RCEP is entered into force. So, it is strongly recommended that the company who would like to utilize RCEP need to take necessary actions before the effectuation of RCEP. For instance, make or review internal rules and flows to utilize FTAs, review whether the existing country of origin of your goods are appropriate, as the rules of origin and RCEP are similar to ones of the existing ASEAN-related FTAs for many goods. Confirm you can receive appropriate supplier certifications from your parts suppliers. Train persons concerned. Further, utilization of IT tools can be a good solution to avoid compliance risk. I believe the effect of FTA is maximized by using it appropriately. So it's all for my part. Thank you very much. Now I'll back to Meiyu.
Thanks, Mitsuko. As you were going through that session, I think we received a query from the audience on under what situation or circumstances that origin verifications would be done. I guess in a nutshell, this would typically be where items that are subject to preferential tariff would otherwise be subject to a higher duty on an MFN basis, and therefore there is a lot more impetus or interest by customs authorities to audit to make sure that those goods actually satisfy the origin rules to be able to benefit from preferential duty. Thank you, Mitsuko. I think the topic of verification is generally under discussed, and with any new FTAs, most planning is usually done to benefit from preferential tariff on imports, as opposed to doing post-import planning, and to ensure that the claims can withstand customs scrutiny later on. And as we all know, audit and investigations can be 3 years, can be 5 years. Some limitation periods are also up to 7 years. So I think this discussion is definitely very helpful to let our audience know that when planning upfront, that they should also have a section on the audits as well. So with that, let me now turn on to the topic of e-commerce and what the obligations are under RCEP. That would help facilitate and enable businesses to jump onto the e-commerce bandwagon. As I mentioned earlier, China has come out strongly as one of the leading proponents of e-commerce trade in this region. It has also come up with various domestic incentives for businesses to set up via e-commerce. Can we now turn to Dolly to take us through the e-commerce chapter within RCEP and share with us some of the recent initiatives announced by the Chinese government to promote e-commerce. Over to you, Dolly.
Thank you. In Chapter 12 of the RCEP agreement, cross-border e-commerce is outlined as a key sector. This signals the first comprehensive multilateral agreement of the e-commerce rules achieved in the whole Asia-Pacific region. The chapter e-commerce of RCEP puts forward 3 major goals, which are promoting the wide use of e-commerce, creating a good environment for the use of e-commerce, and strengthening the cooperation between parties. Specifically, this chapter lists the provision to encourage parties to improve trade management and procedures through electronic means, mainly including promoting paperless trading, electronic authorization, and e-signature. At the same time, this chapter covers the protection of e-commerce users' personal information, protection of online customers' rights and interests, and strengthening the regulatory cooperation and commercial electronic information. Also very importantly, the contracting parties also agree to maintain the current practice of no tariff on e-commerce in accordance with the decision of the WTO conference. In addition to the principles and objectives, if we're looking at the cross-border e-commerce chapter, it focuses on the trade facilitations, creating good e-commerce environment, and also the promoting cross-border e-commerce. This content will provide common ground for the member states to strengthen cooperation in the areas of cross-border e-commerce. It will help to create good environment for the of e-commerce and greatly promote the development of e-commerce in this region.
I think Dolly could be having some technical issues with the connection. Give her a couple of seconds to see if she's able to rejoin. If not, I will be more than happy to cover. If we can move on to the next slide, let's look at the potential impact of RCEP on the cross-border e-commerce. So because RCEP provides a more open and collaborative regional working mechanism of e-commerce, it will help the region's cross-border e-commerce platforms as a whole. For the CBEC marketplace, or operator perspective, the procurement management is no longer limited to the country of manufacturing, and this is specific to the China regime. For e-commerce platforms, the strategic could be from RCEP countries to RCEP countries, extending from the domestic to the whole EP region. Cross-border e-commerce mainly centers on consumer goods currently, and many of the most popular imports amongst Chinese consumers come from member countries within RCEP, such as cosmetics from South Korea, electronics and food products from Japan, rice from Thailand, dairy products from New Zealand and Australia. So RCEP will enrich the variety of choices for consumers. In terms of duty reduction, I think China already provides a zero rate for CBEC import duties, and several members provide low duty rates on B2C imports. But the tariff reduction under RCEP will benefit more of the B2B exporters. Now, the RCEP will enable regional manufacturing enterprises to explore overseas markets So, for example, made in China products may find better ways to enter member countries within the region, since factors such as customs clearance and logistics efficiency, will all be improved as a result of the agreement. And we also anticipate that Japan will see a greater e-commerce opportunities in the region, since RCEP is Japan's first free trade agreement with vital trading partners in North Asia, comprising China and South Korea. The more opened up in service and investment sectors will also provide more flexibilities to e-commerce, something that will come to in a bit more detail in a while. In ASEAN, taking for example the setting up of overseas warehouses and the establishment of freight forwarding business. Currently this could be problematic due to restrictions on foreign shareholding and laws and domestic regulations. But as we will see later, with the ability to expand into these sectors via the trade and services provisions, this could be an opportunity for many businesses wishing to go outbound. So maybe with that, we can move on to the trade and services chapter, and perhaps Dolly, once she's back on, will be able to help us filled in terms of the answers to the some of the questions that we've received on the platform. So moving now to the services chapter, I will start by introducing the 4 modes of supply as commitments made by the RCEP member states to open up their service sectors are based on these 4 modes. So on the top left corner, mode 1 covers a cross-border supply where a user in country A receives services from abroad, for example, via its telecoms or postal infrastructure. Such supplies may include consultancy or market research reports, telemedical advice, distance training, or architectural drawings. Mode 2 involves the consumption abroad, where nationals of country A, for example, goes abroad as a tourist, a student, or patient to consume services in country B. Mode 3 involves the setting up of a commercial presence in another country, and this is where we will focus on in the next couple of slides. And lastly, Mode 4 involves the movement of natural persons, where, for example, a national of country A travels to country B to provide services under a contract to provide services in that country. Next slide, please. So the service commitments are made based on the WTO services sectoral classification list. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the categories of the services sector, essentially these can fall under 12 broad categories ranging from business services, communications services, construction and related engineering services, things like distribution, which covers retail, wholesale trade, and even franchising, educational services, financial.
Okay, it seems we've lost Meng there, so I can jump in and continue with the discussion on services until he returns. So as Meng was saying, financial services, health-related services, tourism and travel-related services, recreational, cultural and sporting activities, transport activities, and finally other services which are not included elsewhere. So depending on which service industry companies are seeking to access, the ability to access such markets will differ based on the specific commitments made by the relevant member state. Let me provide an example in the next slide of five certain selected services and the types of commitments made by countries such as China, Thailand, Vietnam, and the Philippines. Taking the retail trade sector as an example, China has committed to allowing wholly owned foreign entities to carry out retail trade in China with the limitation of those carrying out business by way of a chain selling different types and brands of products where such chain has more than 30 outlets, and restrictions with regard to the types of products that can be distributed by a wholly owned foreign entity. Thailand, in contrast, does not restrict the type of business or product, but only allows foreign companies to hold up to 70% equity, with the remaining 30% being required to be held by a Thai partner. In the second example of the freight forwarding business, China does not have limitations on the ability of foreigners to set up freight forwarding companies, whereas in Thailand, foreigners cannot hold more than 49% of the equity in a freight forwarding entity, and there are also requirements for Thai nationals to sit on the board of directors. Similar requirements and differences in terms of what is offered by China and Thailand for entry into hospital services, data processing services, and the provision of insurance services is also illustrated in this slide, which together with the next slide also provides examples of the differing treatment provided by other RCEP countries, such as Vietnam and the Philippines. In the interest of time, I will not go into each of the commitments in detail, but the materials are available for download after our session, which you may peruse at your convenience. Next slide, please. Investments. So moving on to the investments chapter under RCEP. There are few articles which companies should take note of, as these should be read together with the services chapter, as they provide protection to investors of one RCEP party when making investments in another RCEP party. Some of the key provisions that I would like to highlight are Article 10.2, which provides that this chapter applies to investors of another RCEP party or any covered investments, as the term is defined within the agreement. Next, Articles 10.3 and 10.4 provide the general commitment on member states to afford national treatment and most favoured nation treatment to any foreign investor. Are you back, Meng Yu? Just to quickly check.
If you
okay, I can hand it back. Yes, I can.
Okay, great. So thanks for covering, and our apologies to the folks in the audience. I think this is the first time that we're making use of this new platform, and I guess some technical difficulties, so our apologies for that. So let me just pick up where you left off, David. So Articles 10.3 and 10.4 provide a general commitment on member states to afford national treatment and most favored nation treatment to any foreign investor. And what this means broadly is that member states are required to treat foreign investors and local investors equally and not have rules that discriminate against foreign investors, which is normally the case. Of course, these are subject to the general reservations in Article 10.8. Articles 10.6, 10.11, and 10.13 go further to outline the types of measures that RCEP member states cannot impose on foreign investors. And there are also provisions that provide for the payment of compensation in the event of government expropriation or in select events such as war, riots, or the declaration of emergency. And I think during this period, I think we have seen that happen in a few countries, and where this results in loss to the business in one country, these provisions could be availed of to see whether there is an ability to make claims against member governments. Next slide, please. So here we turn to government procurement. A few points on the government procurement chapter within RCEP, as the ability to supply goods and services to governments around the world represents a key opportunity to businesses, given the often large investment spend that governments have when they procure goods and services. As many of those on the line, may be aware, the process of tendering for supplies of goods and services to governments are often complex. The rules are opaque, and therefore what the chapter within RCEP does is that it receives commitments by member states, or imposes a discipline for member states to publish all laws and regulations with regards to the government procurement regime, to make tenders publicly available, and to carry out the tender process in accordance with generally accepted government procurement principles. And since many of the tender opportunities tend to be in the national language of each country, there is also a provision in RCEP that obliges member states to endeavor to make such information available in the English language. Next slide, please. So finally, no presentation on any mega regional FTA would be complete without covering also the dispute settlement mechanism that is available. Given that investors and companies that are trading goods or moving services cross borders, they would need to know what to do when things go wrong. So Chapter 19 of RCEP sets out the procedures for dispute settlement, which starts off with a consultation process between the member states. This is followed by a more formal procedure of the setting up of a panel if the dispute cannot be resolved via consultation. So following this review, it is found that a member state has failed with regards to its commitments under RCEP, whether to reduce duties on certain goods or in preventing access to its markets, services markets, or even expropriating investments in their country. The panel is allowed to decide on the compensation that the member state is required to pay, or to allow the complaining party to suspend commitments that it has offered to the offending party, in other words, and it is also allowed to close its market or to retract beneficial treatment to the country that has failed to abide by its commitment under RCEP. Now that brings me to the end of this part of the presentation. For the next part, I hand it over to Dolly to take us through the conclusion. Over to you, Dolly.
Thank you, Mingyu. So after learning so much highlights of the RCEP, what can company do to take advantage of the RCEP? So if we move to the next slides, there are like a phased approach that we would recommend. At the first step, companies are advised to examine the RCEP and identify the chapters that are relevant to their specific case. From a trade in goods perspective, the implementation of unified rules of origin under RCEP will contribute towards greater flexibility for companies to sourcing from a larger pool of supplies and the choice of where to centralize its manufacturing location, and resulting in more cost-efficient supply chain and more trade connectivity within the region. This will be supported by the increased trade facilitation measures under the RCEP. From a trading service perspective, the commitment made by the member countries to liberalize service sectors and subsectors will encourage more service suppliers who have been seeing market saturation in their home country to venture out into the overseas markets, comforted by regulation changes that will formally allow market entry into the divided area. This will further result in greater trade connectivity and integration of business operation within the 15 member countries. Similarly, increased overseas investment are likely in the relevant sectors committed for open under the investment chapters, while via direct equity shareholding or joint venture with domestic partners, commitment around freer capital flows will also provide the assurance for companies to venture abroad into the market of the other member countries. And at the second step, companies should put the RCEP in the context of their own business plan. For example, companies can review the supply chain to identify whether there's any opportunity for preferential tariff claims and potential market expansion options. Considerations can be given to leverage some trade tools. For example, deploying a global trade radar, property Deloitte tool to carry out data analytics of current supply chain and trade flow in order to mapping out the company's existing regional footprint and looking at import-export data filed with customs authorities. And this will help to identify and priority the areas for the companies. And then, based on the opportunities identified, company can define the steps required in order to realize them, whether a structural or process change are required, and other strategic considerations should be taken place. For example, companies can review the production processes, value adding, and other activities alongside the supply chain to determine whether the goods could satisfy the relevant rules of origin prescribed under the RCEP, or making changes to existing process and activities in order to benefit from the RCEP. In case the company operate across multi-jurisdiction and trade a lot of products, it is also strongly recommended for companies to utilize technology in order to simplify the increasing compliance needs. So, for example, companies can consider deploying the GTA Review Smart at Deloitte web-based health check tool or Trade Campus, which is a FTA and tariff planning finder, and also trade classifier in order to enable them to do this more efficiently. Last but not least, it is important to ensure that any changes to sourcing countries' pricing, origin criteria are duly captured when the origin declarations are made in order to avoid a later verification by the authorities. Considerations can be given to obtain binding rulings from the authorities, conducting self-review and making voluntary disclosure in order to obtain certainty about the eligibility and also to make sure that the tariff planning or the business activity are in a compliance manner. So that is a summary of the key takeaway. And back to you, Mingyu.
Sure. Thanks, Dolly. I think we can, wrap up by going through some of the questions that we've received in the past hour. I think we have about 7 minutes left, so we are in good time. Just going down the list of questions, I think we have one regarding the fact that in some countries, customs authorities may require invoices from the exporting country in addition to the third-party invoice that is utilized to clear imports. And the example given here is for the Philippines, that in order to apply for preferential duty, customs requires importers to provide the exporting invoice on top of the third-party import invoice. Does Deloitte see similar occurrences in other countries? And if there are any insights as to whether the authorities will progress facilitation under new FTAs. So maybe I can take this and for the rest of the panelists, feel free to add on. I think what I've seen is that in the context of third country or third party invoicing, I think some of the customs authorities, particularly in the Southeast Asia region, have and only in the context of verifying that that the export value or to verify that the goods are actually originating from the exporting country, and basically to complete the supply chain sort of chain to ensure that only goods which are originating are imported and subject to the preferential tariff claims. I think we have seen this not only in Philippines. I think in the past we have also seen this in Thailand, and especially where it involves not only the use of third-party invoicing, but also the use of third country plus back-to-back or back-to-back CO plus third country invoicing. We've also seen some challenges in Malaysia. And maybe this is where I can open up, to Dolly, Mitsuko, David. What about in your jurisdictions? Do you see similar challenges on, third country invoicing situation where the customs authorities also insist on the export invoice to be provided? If you can turn first perhaps to David.
So yeah, thanks, Meng Yu. So not really in Australia. They wouldn't usually ask for that sort of detail. Usually the certificate of origin and the import invoice is sufficient in terms of the documentation that customs are wanting to see. I'm not sure, Dolly, any comments for China?
Yeah, for China, we do see from time to time, it's possible that customs may want to see the whole audit trail of the different invoices, including the export invoice, to make sure that the third-party invoice or third country invoice is authentic. But in the case that there are some information which are sensitive, such as the exporter's price information, it is possible to align with customs that only to show some of the data fields, because the key purpose for customs at the destination country is to verify that the goods stated in the origin certificate and export invoice are consistent with what is imported. Yeah, mainly that is our experience. It's possible, but can be managed.
What about in Japan, Mitsuko?
Thank you, Mayu. Japan, as for Japan, the same as Australia. And so, the authority do not require such additional invoices.
Okay. I suspect that as we move towards self-certification and the combining of single windows within more countries, or even direct submission of ECOs by one authority to another, this could hopefully be a concern of the past. But I guess in the meantime, certainly something that I think many businesses also face, and practically to manage the concerns about price, sensitivities, and also managing the leakage of such information to the importers. Then it sounds like discussions would need to be had on a more local level with the customs authorities. Okay, I think that is unfortunately all that we have time for. David, Dolly, Mitsuko, thank you very much for presenting today. Special thanks to all of you who were able to join us. We would like to encourage all of you to fill out a short survey that will pop up on your screen momentarily and tell us what you think about today's program. If you join us late, there will be a recording of this presentation that is archived. Feel free to download them at deloitte.com/ap/debriefs. Also, if you think of any other questions or comments, feel free to email me or any of our speakers. We'll be more than happy to respond to you via email. And please don't forget to tune in to our next scheduled webcast on the Geography update series on the 16th of February, titled 2021 Japan Tax Reform Proposals, Pursuit of Shifting Policy Priorities. And last, from all of us at Deloitte, thank you very much for your participation today, and my apologies again for all of the technical difficulties faced today. Thank you and goodbye.